Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on something pretty big in the world of trade and climate action. The EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
You need CBAM.
Yeah, CBAM. It's like the EU's way of saying, hey, if you want to sell stuff to us, you got to be mindful of your carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We've got this research paper from the Journal of Finance and Economics to help us break it all down.
That's good.
And we're especially interested in how CBAM might impact Taiwan.
Taiwan, yeah. They're a major player in the global supply chain.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people are wondering,
What's that?
how could CBAM impact, the prices of everyday goods, things like that?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
Right. So before we get into the specifics of Taiwan, can you give us just a little background on CBAM? Like, what's the big idea behind it?
Sure. I think it all starts with this growing concern globally about climate change and this need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right?
Yeah.
The Paris Agreement, which aims to limit global warming, has been kind of a driving force behind a lot of this.
For sure.
And the EU, especially, has set these ambitious goals to get to net zero emissions by 2050.
Right.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
If companies in the EU face all these strict regulations and higher costs to reduce their emissions,
Yeah.
they might just shift their production to countries that have, less strict rules.
Oh, I see.
And that's what's known as carbon leakage.
Carbon leakage.
And it could actually undermine global efforts to combat climate change.
So it's like you try to reduce emissions in one place and they just pop up somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. Like whack-a-mole with carbon emissions.
Whack-a-mole. I like that.
And that's where CBAM comes in.
Okay.
It's designed to prevent that leakage by kind of leveling the playing field.
Okay.
It puts a price on carbon emissions for imports.
Gotcha.
So it makes sure that goods coming into the EU, they face similar carbon costs no matter where they were made.
So it's not about punishing certain companies.
Right.
It's about making sure everyone is kind of playing by the same rules.
Exactly. It's about creating this system where everyone has that incentive to reduce their carbon footprint.
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's bring Taiwan into this.
Okay.
Why is Taiwan particularly affected by CBAM?
Well, Taiwan is a huge exporter, especially of manufactured goods like electronics and stuff.
Right.
And a big chunk of those exports go right to the EU. They've built this really strong economy based on manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so that kind of makes them, vulnerable to changes in trade policies, especially ones that have to do with carbon emissions.
So even though Taiwan isn't part of the EU,
Right.
the EU's policies can still have a big impact on their economy.
Exactly, yeah. And while Taiwan has made some progress in reducing their carbon intensity in certain areas, like steel production, they still face some challenges in meeting, the EU's stricter standards.
So what kind of impact could this actually have on Taiwan? I mean, will it be a big hit to their economy, or will they be able to adapt?
Well, this research paper we're looking at today,
Yeah.
it offers some interesting insights into that.
Okay, good.
They analyzed Taiwan's export data from 2016 to 2021,
Okay,
paying close attention to those sectors most likely to be impacted by CBAM.
okay.
Things like steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, and power equipment.
Right, the things that are really carbon intensive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what they found is that the immediate impact might not be as dramatic as some people think.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah, it is a little bit.
Why is that? Is it because they're already taking steps to reduce emissions in those areas?
It's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
The data show that Taiwan mainly sends finished goods to the EU, not the raw materials that CBAM is currently focused on.
I see.
So, for example, they export a lot of electronics, which are already assembled, rather than just the raw steel or aluminum that goes into making them.
Right.
So in the short term, their current export structure might actually provide a little bit of a buffer.
So they've got a little breathing room. It sounds like they can't get too comfortable.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
CBAM is expected to expand in the next 2 years.
Okay.
And as it starts to include more manufactured goods,
Yeah.
the pressure on Taiwan to reduce emissions throughout their entire supply chain, that's going to intensify.
Okay. So they might be able to kind of avoid the biggest impact right now,
Yeah,
but they need to be thinking long term.
exactly. And that's where their own efforts to lower their carbon footprint become really important.
Okay, let's talk about those efforts. The research paper also looked at what Taiwan is doing to become more sustainable.
Yeah.
What did they find there?
Well, they found that they've actually made some pretty encouraging progress.
That's good.
Yeah, in recent years.
Okay.
They looked at their CO2 emissions per unit of GDP and saw a decreasing trend, which is good.
So that means they're getting more efficient, right?
Yes.
Using less energy and producing fewer emissions.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about cutting emissions overall. It's about decoupling economic growth from that environmental impact.
I see.
Yeah.
And it's not just government policies, right? Businesses and consumers are making different choices too.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great.
It's not just about top-down policies. It's about those individual choices that people and companies are making.
That's really encouraging.
It is. It's a good sign.
So what are some of those specific policies? Is the Taiwanese government doing anything to promote carbon reduction?
Yeah, definitely. They've committed to the Paris Agreement.
Okay.
And they've set targets to get to net zero emissions by 2050.
Ambitious.
Yeah, very ambitious.
Okay.
They've got a bunch of policies and programs to promote things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, carbon capture technologies, all sorts of things.
They're taking a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that this is a journey. There will be bumps in the road, but the key is to just keep moving forward.
Keep making progress.
Yeah, and adapt as things change.
Okay, so we've talked about CBAM, Taiwan's exports, and their efforts to reduce their own emissions. But I hear the research paper threw in some curveballs too.
Oh yeah, definitely. There are some really interesting findings that challenge what we think we know about emissions and the economy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did they find?
One of the most interesting things was a negative correlation between carbon emissions and the consumer price index for food.
What?
In Taiwan.
Wait, so you're saying that as people in Taiwan spend more money eating out at restaurants, carbon emissions actually go down?
That's what the data show, yeah.
That seems backwards.
Yeah.
Isn't eating out usually associated with a higher carbon footprint?
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
That's what makes this finding so fascinating.
Okay, I'm hooked. What are some possible explanations for this?
Well, one possibility is that restaurants in Taiwan are just adopting sustainable practices way faster than other places.
Okay.
Maybe they're focusing on local ingredients to cut down on those transportation emissions.
Yeah.
Minimizing food waste or investing in more energy efficient cooking methods.
Right. So it's not just about policies, it's about businesses taking the initiative.
Yeah, exactly. And it's possible that consumers are also playing a role.
How so?
Maybe Taiwanese diners are just more aware of their environmental impact now, and they're choosing to eat at places that align with their values.
Yeah, I can see that.
And that could actually create a market-driven push for restaurants to become more sustainable.
That's a win-win, right? Diners get to enjoy good food.
Exactly.
And support businesses that are doing the right thing for the planet.
Yeah, it's a great example of how economic growth and environmental protection don't always have to be at odds.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm ready for another surprising finding from this research. What else did they find?
All right, well, another interesting correlation they found was between land value-added tax and carbon emissions.
Wait, land tax? What does that have to do with carbon emissions?
It might seem strange at first.
Yeah.
But it makes sense when you think about how we use land.
Okay.
This land value-added tax in Taiwan, it's designed to encourage people to use land efficiently and discourage those activities that could actually increase emissions.
So it's not just about getting more tax money, it's about influencing how people use land.
Exactly. And the research actually found a positive correlation between this tax and carbon emissions, particularly in construction.
Okay, how does it work?
Well, construction uses a lot of materials like steel and cement.
Which are carbon intensive to produce?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when this land tax increases, it can indirectly make construction projects more expensive,
Okay.
which can slow down construction overall.
Got it.
And that then reduces demand for those carbon-intensive materials.
So it's like a chain reaction. The tax affects land use, which then impacts the construction industry and their emissions.
Precisely.
Wow, it's all connected.
It is. And on top of that, the money from this tax can actually be used to fund environmental initiatives.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Things like reforestation, restoring ecosystems.
Okay.
So it could potentially help offset some of those carbon impacts.
So it's like they're trying to balance things out.
Right, exactly.
Encourage economic activity, but also minimize the damage to the environment.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance, for sure.
Absolutely.
It shows how complex these issues are.
Yeah.
And why we need to think carefully about policies and their wider impacts.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the basics of CBAM, a bit about Taiwan's economy and their efforts to reduce their impact on the environment. But how does all of this actually play out in the real world?
That's a great question. And that's where looking at Taiwan's export data gets really interesting.
Okay.
We need to see where those CBAM regulated products are actually going
Right.
and how those trade flows might be affected by these new policies.
Let's do it.
Okay. Remember those 5 categories we talked about?
The fertilizers, cement, steel, aluminum.
Yeah, and power equipment.
Right. The ones most likely to get hit with those carbon border taxes.
Exactly.
Under CBAM.
Yep.
So where is Taiwan sending all that stuff?
Well, the research dug into that.
Okay, good.
And over the past 6 years, most of those exports have actually been going to countries outside of Europe,
Oh, interesting.
not so much to the EU.
Huh. So maybe the immediate impact of CBAM on those industries won't be as big as some people are saying?
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay.
But we have to remember that this data is just a snapshot in time, right?
Yep.
Things could change as CBAM is implemented and expands to cover more stuff.
For sure. So if those products aren't mainly going to the EU, where are they going?
China, the US, Japan, Vietnam.
Okay. All over the place.
Yeah, Taiwan has a pretty diverse export portfolio.
It's like a safety net.
Yeah, exactly.
If one market gets tougher because of something like CBAM, they've got other options.
Right.
Smart.
Now let's zoom in on their trade with the EU specifically. It's still a big chunk of their total exports.
Yeah, and we know the EU is serious about those low carbon goals.
Oh yeah.
So what are they sending over there?
Well, before the pandemic, it was a lot of motorcycle and bicycle components.
Okay.
But things have shifted a bit since then.
Yeah, everyone was buying bikes during the pandemic.
Right. Everyone wanted to get outside.
Exactly.
And that includes people in Europe.
Makes sense.
They've had a huge increase in demand for electric bicycles.
Driven by those environmental concerns we were talking about.
And also government subsidies.
Right, those help.
And guess who a major supplier of electric bicycles is?
I bet it's Taiwan.
You got it.
See, they're adaptable.
They are.
It's like one door closes and another one opens.
Exactly.
But they're still sending over those more traditional exports too, right?
Oh yeah, electronics and machinery are still big for Taiwan's trade with the EU.
Okay, so we have a good picture of what Taiwan is exporting overall. But let's focus on those CBAM regulated products specifically and where they're going within the EU. What does that look like?
Well, it turns out Germany is the biggest importer of those things from Taiwan,
Interesting.
followed by the Netherlands.
Makes sense. Those are two of the biggest economies in the EU.
Yeah, and the Netherlands has that huge port in Rotterdam.
Right. It's like the gateway to Europe.
Exactly. So even though the EU is trying to reduce carbon-intensive imports, it looks like they still rely on countries like Taiwan for certain goods.
At least for now.
Yeah, we'll have to see how things evolve.
Right. It's definitely a complex situation.
It is, but there's one more piece to consider.
Okay.
What kinds of CBAM regulated products is Taiwan actually sending to the EU?
Because we know that initially CBAM is going to target those raw materials.
Right, things like cement and steel.
Exactly.
But the data show pretty clearly that Taiwan's main exports to the EU are still manufactured goods,
Okay.
not those raw materials.
So more finished products like the electronics and machinery.
Right, not just the ingredients that go into making them.
I see. So they might be able to avoid the biggest hit from CBAM, at least at first.
Yeah, it seems like their current export structure is buying them some time.
They've got a little breathing room.
Exactly, but they can't just wait and see what happens.
They've got to stay proactive.
Right. As CBAM expands to include more manufactured goods, Taiwan will need to be ready.
Speaking of being ready, let's take a closer look at their carbon emissions data.
Okay.
What did the research tell us about that?
Well, they looked at Taiwan's carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP
Okay.
from 2011 to 2021.
So this tells us how carbon intensive their economy is.
Exactly.
And what did they find? Are things moving in the right direction?
The good news is that these emissions have been going down over the years.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, it means they're making progress on decoupling economic growth from environmental impact.
So they're getting more efficient.
Right.
How do they compare to other countries?
Well, their emissions are still higher than places like Germany.
They're a leader in renewable energy.
That's right. But they're comparable to countries like Canada and Ukraine.
So they're kind of in the middle of the pack globally.
Yeah, you could say that.
But at least they're moving in the right direction.
Definitely.
We've talked about trade, emissions, economic growth. It's all connected.
It is.
How does it all fit together when it comes to CBAM in Taiwan?
Well, that's where the regression analysis comes in.
Okay, the stats.
Yeah, the researchers use these statistical models to understand how all these different factors relate to each other.
So what do they find?
One of the main things they found was that Taiwan's carbon emissions are negatively correlated
Okay.
with the production of electronic components.
Interesting.
Employment in the power machinery sector
Okay.
and spending on dining out.
Wait, hold on. How can spending on dining out be negatively correlated with emissions?
I know, right?
Doesn't eating out usually mean a higher carbon footprint?
You'd think so, but that's what makes this so interesting.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of what you'd expect.
Exactly. It suggests something unique is going on in Taiwan's restaurant industry.
They're managing to lower emissions, even as people spend more money eating out.
It seems that way.
So what's the secret?
Well, it could be that restaurants there are adopting those sustainable practices faster than we see elsewhere.
Like what?
They might be using more local ingredients.
To reduce transportation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Minimizing food waste. Maybe they're using more energy efficient equipment in their kitchens.
Right, so it's kind of like what we saw with their electronics industry.
Yeah, kind of.
Efficiency and innovation leading to more sustainability.
Yeah, and it could be driven by consumers too.
How so?
Maybe Taiwanese diners are more aware of their impact and they're choosing to eat at places that reflect those values.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a win-win, right? You get to enjoy a good meal
Right.
and support businesses that are doing the right thing.
Exactly.
It challenges the idea that economic growth and protecting the environment have to be in conflict.
Absolutely. Were there any other surprises from this analysis?
Oh yeah.
Okay, tell me.
They also found a strong positive correlation
Okay.
between Taiwan's emissions and things like metal production,
Okay.
construction, that land value add tax we talked about,
Right.
and even the profitability of the steel industry.
So it sounds like those industries might need to step up their game when it comes to sustainability.
It does seem that way, yeah.
It's not an easy fix, though.
No, it's not.
Those industries are a big part of Taiwan's economy.
They are.
So it's about finding that balance again.
Right.
Trying to reduce emissions without slowing down their economic growth.
Exactly. And that's where policies like CBAM come into play.
Okay.
They're meant to encourage those industries to adopt those more sustainable practices.
By making it financially worthwhile to reduce their carbon footprint.
Yeah, kind of nudging them in the right direction.
Nudging them, I like that. It feels like we're moving into this whole new world where sustainability is just part of doing business.
Yeah, it's a big shift.
And Taiwan's experience, it gives us a lot to think about.
Yeah, sure.
But let's bring it back to our listeners for a minute.
Okay.
What does all this mean for everyday people? How could CBAM and all these global changes actually impact our lives?
Well, I think it shows us that climate change isn't some far-off problem anymore.
Right.
It's affecting global trade, economic policies, and ultimately it's going to impact our day-to-day lives.
We can't just ignore it.
No, not anymore.
And even though CBAM might seem like, I don't know, a really complicated policy happening somewhere else,
Yeah,
it's probably going to have ripple effects throughout the entire global economy.
definitely. We're already seeing companies change their supply chains.
Really?
Yeah, and investing in cleaner technologies because they know these carbon border taxes are coming.
So these changes are happening now, even before CBAM is fully in place.
Exactly.
And those changes are probably going to affect us as consumers too, right?
Yeah, probably. We might see prices go up on some imported goods.
Because companies will pass on the cost of complying with CBAM.
Right, exactly.
So it's not just some abstract economic theory. It could actually affect what we buy at the store.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's not all bad news, right?
No, definitely not.
CBAM could also lead to some really cool innovations
For sure.
and create new markets for those sustainable products.
Yeah, as companies try to reduce their footprint,
Yeah.
we might see a much bigger demand for things like electric vehicles, renewable energy tech, eco-friendly building materials, all sorts of things.
It could be like a whole new wave of green consumerism.
Yeah, exactly. And that could mean new jobs,
All right.
a boost to the economy.
And it helps us tackle climate change.
It's about finding those win-win solutions.
So it's not just about avoiding penalties, it's about seeing those new opportunities.
Exactly. I think we're seeing a real change in how we think about the economy and the environment.
Yeah.
It's not this either-or thing anymore.
We need a healthy planet to have a healthy economy.
Right, and CBAM is just one example of how policies can bring those two goals together.
As we wrap up our deep dive into CBAM and Taiwan, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
I think the main thing is that the world is changing. And we all have a part to play in making it more sustainable.
Yeah.
Whether you're a business leader, a policymaker, or just an everyday person, your choices matter.
We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix this.
Right. It's going to take all of us working together.
And Taiwan shows us that embracing sustainability can have all sorts of unexpected benefits.
Yeah, from a booming electronics industry to a more environmentally conscious restaurant scene.
It's about thinking differently, innovating, working together to create a world where the economy and the environment can both thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
For our listeners who want to learn even more about this, definitely check out that research paper from the Journal of Finance and Economics.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
It'll give you a whole new perspective on what's happening in the world.
And this is just the beginning.
Right.
As CBAM evolves and more countries start doing similar things, we're going to see even more changes in the years to come.
So stay curious, stay engaged, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the topics that matter.
We'll see you next time.
Until then,